Osama bin Laden, A Biography of Radicalism and Rebellion. Part 1. Origins and Childhood in the House of bin Laden. Osama bin Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden was born on the 10th of March, 1957, into one of the most powerful and prominent families in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Although official documents and some international sources once listed the city of Jeddah as his place of birth, it is now widely accepted that his actual birthplace was the Saudi capital, Riyadh. The bin Laden family, known for its immense wealth and deep-rooted ties to the Saudi royal establishment, had already risen to national prominence by the time of Osama's birth. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, was a self-made tycoon of Yemeni origin. Born in 1908 in Hadramaut, Yemen, Mohammed's early life was shaped by poverty and hardship. In search of opportunity, the family migrated north to the Hijaz region along the Red Sea, an area then marked by tribal disputes and contested sovereignty between the waning Ottoman Empire and the rising House of Saud. With the establishment of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932 under the leadership of Abdulaziz ibn Saud, Mohammed found his path to fortune. He became a favored construction contractor for the royal family, working directly under Ibn Saud and later his successors. Mohammed bin Laden's reputation as a builder of vision and reliability earned him numerous lucrative contracts, especially in the realm of religious and state-sponsored architecture. His firm, which would become known as the Saudi Bin Laden Group, flourished under royal patronage, and by the 1950s it had become the premier construction company in Saudi Arabia. It played a critical role in modernizing the kingdom, constructing roads, airports, and, most significantly, being entrusted with the upkeep and renovation of Islam's holiest sites, the Grand Mosque in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. As Saudi Arabia's oil wealth exploded in the mid-20th century, so too did the fortune of Mohammed bin Laden. He was a millionaire many times over by the time Osama was born, and adjusted for inflation, his wealth would be worth billions today. Osama's mother, Hamida al-Adas, came from a different world. She was a young Syrian girl of Alawite descent, reportedly from a prosperous family of citrus farmers based near the coastal city of Latakia. In 1956, at the age of only 14, she became Mohammed bin Laden's 10th wife. He was 48 at the time. A year later, Hamida gave birth to their only child, Osama. Soon afterward, the marriage ended, or perhaps was never fully formalized. This ambiguity led to persistent speculation that Hamida may have been Muhammad's concubine rather than a legally recognized wife under Islamic law. Following the separation, Hamida remarried. Her new husband, Mohammed al-Adas, was a business associate of her former husband. With him, she had 4 more children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. Osama bin Laden thus spent most of his formative years living in a blended household with his mother, stepfather, and half-siblings. While some accounts suggest he was emotionally distant from his biological father, other testimonies indicate that Mohammed bin Laden still took an active role in Osama's upbringing, especially in terms of religious education and moral discipline. Mohammed was known for his strict adherence to conservative Islamic principles, a mindset he sought to pass down to his many children. Despite these traditional values, Osama's childhood was marked by wealth, comfort, and elite privilege. He attended the prestigious Al-Thaqir Model School in Jeddah, starting in 1968, an institution favored by the children of Saudi Arabia's elite. As a teenager, he was sent abroad to broaden his horizons and was enrolled in a short English language course at Oxford University in the United Kingdom in 1971, a rare opportunity for a young Saudi at that time. This exposure to the Western world, however, did not lead to admiration. Instead, it likely reinforced Osama's belief in the cultural and spiritual superiority of Islamic civilization. Accounts of his early personality and interests paint a picture of a reserved but observant young man. He is said to have developed an early interest in religious studies, poetry, and Arab history, alongside more worldly interests such as football. He reportedly supported Arsenal Football Club, and military history. Despite these elements of normality, it would be misleading to regard Osama's childhood as typical. The world he inhabited was far removed from the ordinary. His family was close to the inner circle of the House of Saud, and the Saudi bin Laden group was at the epicenter of the kingdom's meteoric rise. By the 1960s, Mohammed bin Laden's company had been awarded contracts of national importance. Notably, in 1964, it received the bid to reclad the exterior of the Dome of the Rock, one of Islam's most sacred shrines, located in Jerusalem. Muhammad's close relationship with the Saudi monarchy and his contributions to the Islamic architectural heritage of the Arab world further cemented the family's revered status. However, this golden era came to a sudden and tragic end in 1967. Mohammed bin Laden died in a plane crash in Saudi Arabia when the pilot miscalculated the landing approach. He was 59 years old. His untimely death did not spell the end of the family's empire. Several of his elder sons, Osama's half-brothers, took over the Saudi bin Laden group and successfully steered it into new markets. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the firm diversified and expanded across the Middle East, becoming a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Yet Osama, who was just 10 years old at the time of his father's death, was too young to take part in these developments. His path would diverge from business and lead instead into a life shaped by ideology, conflict, and ultimately infamy. Part 2, a young man of faith and ideology, Osama's university years and growing radicalism. In the years following his father's death in 1967, Osama bin Laden remained firmly embedded in a world of wealth, privilege, and religious tradition. Though his direct connection to the Saudi bin Laden group would remain distant during his youth, his association with the family's vast fortune ensured that his material needs were not only met, but lavishly exceeded. The influence of his father, despite the latter's absence, remained strong. Osama was shaped by both the expectations of the prominent bin Laden legacy and the conservative Islamic atmosphere of Saudi Arabia in the 1970s, a time of mounting religious fervor, ideological shifts, and regional conflict. By the mid-1970s, Osama had entered into adulthood. At the age of 17 in 1974, he married his first wife, Najwa Ghanem. She was not only young, just 15 years old, but also his first cousin on his mother's side. This marriage marked the beginning of a series of unions that would reflect both tribal tradition and religious conservatism. Najwa would be the first of at least 5 wives, and over the course of his life, Osama would father more than 20 children. His personal life was rooted in the norms of patriarchal Islamic society, in which early marriage and large families were seen as virtuous and emblematic of male responsibility and religious obedience. In 1976, Osama began his higher education at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. This institution, one of the most prestigious in Saudi Arabia, was a natural fit for a young man of his background. He initially enrolled in a program for economics and business administration, a decision likely influenced by the expectation that he would eventually assume some role in the ever-expanding family enterprise. Yet Osama was not drawn to corporate leadership or economic strategy. Even as he took courses in finance and business management, his interests increasingly lay elsewhere. Reports from peers and professors during his time at university paint a picture of a pensive and devout young man, more absorbed in Islamic theology, history, and poetry than in the study of macroeconomics. He often attended lectures not directly related to his formal course of study, particularly those focused on Islamic jurisprudence, Sharia, the Quran, and Arab literature. His poetic sensibilities were surprisingly refined. Osama reportedly composed his own verses and displayed an admiration for classical Islamic and Arab poetry, often reflecting themes of martyrdom, piety, and divine justice. The real transformation in Osama's life during his university years came through his ideological exposure. King Abdulaziz University was a hotbed of Islamic thought in the 1970s, hosting some of the most influential radical thinkers of the time. Chief among them was Muhammad Qutb, the brother of Sayyid Qutb, a prominent Egyptian Islamist philosopher, revolutionary and leading ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood. Sayyid Qutb's legacy loomed large over much of the Islamic world by this point. Executed in 1966 by Egyptian authorities for plotting against the government, his writings continued to circulate widely in Arab and Islamic intellectual circles. His magnum opus, Milestones, became a foundational text for generations of young Islamists, including Osama. In it, Qutb advanced a vision of Islam as a complete way of life, not merely a religion. He argued that the modern world, especially the West, was immersed in jahiliyyah, or ignorance, and needed to be reformed through a return to pure, uncorrupted Islam governed by Sharia law. Qutb's worldview was marked by his searing critique of secularism, materialism, and Western decadence, all of which he had witnessed firsthand during a trip to the United States in the late 1940s. He condemned the U.S. as spiritually empty and morally bankrupt, contrasting it with the supposedly sacred and righteous path of Islam. His concept of jihad was not merely spiritual but political and militant, a means to resist oppression and establish a global Islamic order. For Osama bin Laden, this ideology was deeply compelling. Under the tutelage of Mohammed and other conservative clerics, he became increasingly convinced that Islam was under siege, not only culturally and politically, but also militarily. The events of the 1960s and 1970s appeared to reinforce this belief. He viewed the successive defeats of Muslim nations in the Arab-Israeli wars, the growth of Western military presence in the Middle East, and the moral erosion he perceived in modern Muslim societies as part of a broader, coordinated assault on Islam itself. Thus, while Osama may have enrolled at King Abdulaziz University to study economics, by the time he left in 1979, though it remains unclear whether he formally graduated, he had emerged as a young man profoundly radicalized, intellectually shaped by the writings of Sayyid Qutb, and practically inspired by his brother's teachings. His path would no longer be that of a business executive or a traditional family man. He was beginning to see himself as a soldier for Islam, one called to restore the glories of the early caliphate and defend the faith through action. His transformation coincided with a series of geopolitical events that would serve as a crucible for his emerging ideology. Two moments in particular were pivotal. First, the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79 shocked the Islamic world. It demonstrated that Western-backed secular regimes could be toppled and replaced by Islamic governments. The Shah of Iran, once thought unassailable, had been ousted, and a theocratic regime under Ayatollah Khomeini had risen in his place. The second and more personally consequential event occurred in Afghanistan. In 1978, a Marxist-Leninist group, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, had seized power in Kabul and begun implementing radical socialist reforms, many of which clashed with the deeply religious and tribal nature of Afghan society. Popular uprisings against the PDPA were soon underway. In response, the Soviet Union launched a full-scale invasion in December 1979 to prop up the communist regime. This moment would prove to be the turning point in Osama bin Laden's life. For a young man already steeped in Islamist thought and burning with the conviction that the Muslim world was under attack, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan presented both a threat and an opportunity. It was, in his eyes, the beginning of a new holy war, a jihad that he was not only morally obligated to support, but destined to lead. Within weeks of the invasion, Osama left Saudi Arabia and traveled to Pakistan. There, on the frontier of the war, he would meet the man who would become his mentor and ideological partner, Abdullah Azzam. Together, they would lay the foundation for what would become one of the most dangerous and consequential terrorist networks in modern history. First through humanitarian aid and mujahideen recruitment, and ultimately through the creation of a movement that would leave an indelible mark on the world. Part 3, Into the Fire. Osama bin Laden and the Afghan Jihad. By the dawn of the 1980s, Osama bin Laden had crossed a threshold. The young Saudi, born into a life of unparalleled privilege, was now fully immersed in the world of militant Islamism. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 was a galvanizing moment for the broader Islamic world. For Osama personally, it served as a divine call to arms. He responded with fervor, seeing the Soviet intervention not as a regional conflict, but as an existential attack on Islam itself. This was not merely politics, it was jihad in its truest and most urgent form. Upon arriving in Pakistan in 1980, Osama found a world already teeming with activity. Millions of Afghan refugees had poured across the border into Pakistan's northwest frontier provinces. Peshawar, in particular, had become the epicenter of both humanitarian efforts and covert warfare. The city was filled with a volatile mix of displaced Afghan families, Islamic clerics, Arab volunteers, Western intelligence agents, and various factions of Afghan mujahideen fighters. In this crucible of ideology, desperation, and global maneuvering, Osama bin Laden began to carve out his own path. His initial efforts were focused on logistics and support rather than direct combat. He was still relatively unknown, though his wealth and connections quickly earned him a degree of influence. Working closely with the Palestinian Islamic scholar Abdullah Azzam, Osama co-founded the Maktab al-Khidamat Services Office, often abbreviated as MAC. This organization was established in 1984 in Peshawar with the purpose of coordinating support for the Afghan jihad. MAC helped fund, recruit, and organize Arab volunteers who wanted to join the struggle against the Soviets. Azzam, a charismatic and widely respected figure, was a key influence on Osama during these years. A former lecturer at King Abdulaziz University, Azzam had long advocated for the centrality of jihad in Islamic life. He rejected the idea that Muslims could remain passive in the face of foreign occupation or perceived oppression. His slogan, "Jihad and the rifle alone, no negotiations, no conferences, and no dialogues," became a mantra for the cause. Under Azzam's mentorship, Osama bin Laden's radical inclinations were further refined and given strategic focus. While other Arab governments were content to offer rhetorical support or limited aid to the Afghan resistance, Osama and Azzam sought to mobilize the entire Islamic world. MAC quickly became a transnational hub for Islamist activity. Volunteers from across the Middle East, North Africa, and even the West began to arrive in Peshawar. Many of these Arab Afghans lacked military experience, but they were driven by religious zeal. MAC provided them with funding, housing, spiritual guidance, and eventually basic military training. Although MAC's primary mission was support-oriented, Osama himself began to transition into a more active combat role. He made frequent visits to the front lines inside Afghanistan, particularly around the volatile regions of Nangarhar and Kunar. These trips were both symbolic and practical. They reinforced his commitment in the eyes of his peers and allowed him to build relationships with key Afghan mujahideen commanders, such as Jalaluddin Haqqani and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Though these alliances were fraught with ideological and tribal tensions, they helped Osama establish operational credibility. It was during these excursions into Afghanistan that Osama began to be seen as more than just a rich Saudi idealist. Accounts from fellow fighters describe him as disciplined, austere, and surprisingly fearless. He reportedly lived simply, avoiding luxury, engaging in manual labor, and praying fervently. His leadership style emphasized humility, obedience to divine law, and unwavering commitment to the mission. These traits earned him admiration among the Arab volunteers and helped elevate his status from financier to field commander. At the same time, Osama maintained a deepening sense of religious and historical purpose. He often spoke of the Afghan jihad in grandiose, civilizational terms. For him, the struggle against the Soviets was a continuation of the great battles of Islamic history, an effort to revive the lost glory of the early caliphates and to resist the secular, materialist ideologies that had, in his view, corrupted the Muslim world. He saw himself as part of a prophetic continuum, a restorer of Islamic unity, purity, and global authority. The 1980s also marked a significant shift in international involvement in Afghanistan. The United States, through the CIA's Operation Cyclone, funneled billions of dollars in aid, weapons, and intelligence to the Afghan mujahideen, often in coordination with Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI) agency. While Osama's group was not a direct recipient of CIA funds, despite persistent rumors to the contrary, the atmosphere of global anti-communist cooperation created the space in which radical Islamist networks could flourish unchecked. By the late 1980s, Osama had become one of the most visible and influential figures among the Arab-Afghan contingent. He built training camps, financed weapons shipments, and even established hospitals for wounded fighters. His personal wealth, estimated to be in the tens of millions of dollars, was a crucial resource. More importantly, his network of financial and ideological supporters stretched across the Gulf states, North Africa, and into parts of Southeast Asia and Europe. One of the most significant, though less discussed, aspects of this period was the extent to which Osama bin Laden began to envision jihad as a global rather than localized campaign. While many of his Afghan comrades saw the struggle as a national liberation effort confined to their homeland, Osama began to articulate a much broader mission. He spoke increasingly of Western imperialism, Zionist influence, and the moral degradation of Muslim societies. Afghanistan, in his eyes, was not the end. It was the beginning. In 1989, as the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in defeat, Osama bin Laden celebrated the victory with millions of other Muslims. Yet his response was not to return home or retire into business. On the contrary, he believed the war had proven that a small, committed group of mujahideen could defeat a superpower. If this could be achieved against the Soviets, why not against the Americans, the Israelis, or the corrupt regimes ruling much of the Muslim world? It was at this historical juncture that Osama parted ways with Abdullah Azzam. The split was as much ideological as it was personal. Azzam had favored maintaining a focus on Afghanistan and rebuilding the country through Islamic governance. Osama, increasingly militant and revolutionary in outlook, wanted to export jihad globally. Their divergence became irreconcilable in 1989, and later that year, Azzam was assassinated in a car bomb explosion in Peshawar under mysterious circumstances. The perpetrators were never definitively identified, and speculation persists to this day about whether Osama was involved or whether rival factions within the mujahideen or regional intelligence services played a role. With Azzam gone and the Afghan war winding down, Osama bin Laden was left with a hardened core of loyal fighters, a broad network of international contacts, and a burning ambition to reshape the world. What came next would change history. Part 4. Return to the Kingdom. Disillusionment in Saudi Arabia and the road to militancy. In 1989, as the Soviet Union completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia. He came back a transformed man, no longer just a wealthy scion of the bin Laden construction empire, but now a seasoned mujahid, battle-hardened and ideologically driven. In his eyes, the triumph in Afghanistan had confirmed a divine mandate, a sign that true believers, through jihad, could defeat even the mightiest of empires. He returned home as a hero to some, especially among the conservative clerical class, but others in the Saudi royal court viewed him as a potential source of trouble. Osama found the Saudi state not as he had hoped. He was dismayed by what he saw as spiritual decay and moral compromise at the heart of the kingdom. The country had grown immensely wealthy through oil revenues, but Osama saw the ruling class increasingly beholden to Western interests, particularly those of the United States. Western products flooded the markets. Western lifestyles were embraced by the elite. American corporations were embedded in Saudi infrastructure, and most significantly to Osama, American troops were being invited onto what he regarded as sacred Islamic soil. Although Osama initially attempted to channel his energy through legitimate and religious avenues, he quickly found himself at odds with the state's position. He gave sermons in mosques and informal gatherings, denouncing corruption, materialism, and the influence of non-Muslim powers in the Muslim world. His message struck a chord among segments of the population, particularly among younger Saudis disillusioned by the gap between Islamic ideals and the perceived moral failures of the Saudi monarchy. He continued to maintain his network of former Afghan fighters, known as the Arab Afghans, and increasingly referred to global events through the lens of Islamic eschatology and revivalism. Then came 1990, the year that would alter Osama bin Laden's relationship with the Saudi state irreparably. In August of that year, Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invaded neighboring Kuwait. The act stunned the Arab world and triggered an immediate crisis. Saudi Arabia, directly threatened by Iraqi aggression and lacking a large modernized army, made a fateful decision. King Fahd invited U.S. and coalition troops into the kingdom to protect its oil fields and territorial sovereignty. Within weeks, tens of thousands of American soldiers, many of them non-Muslims, were stationed in Saudi Arabia, including near the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. To Osama, this was an abomination. He saw it as a betrayal of Islam and a violation of the sanctity of the land that had birthed the Prophet Muhammad. He was not alone in his outrage. Many clerics and conservative scholars voiced similar concerns, but Osama's condemnation was more public and more confrontational. He offered the Saudi royal family an alternative plan. He would mobilize his Arab-Afghan veterans to defend the kingdom without the need for foreign armies. This proposal was dismissed by the monarchy as unrealistic and possibly dangerous. Humiliated and increasingly angry, Osama escalated his rhetoric. He began accusing the Saudi government of apostasy, declaring that by allying with non-Muslim powers and inviting them into Islam's heartland, the rulers had forfeited their legitimacy. His stance was viewed by the Saudi intelligence services as inflammatory and destabilizing. The royal family had tolerated some of his earlier criticism, but his open defiance during this crisis crossed a line. The state began to monitor his activities more closely, and restrictions were placed on his public appearances. Despite the growing pressure, Osama continued to speak out. He issued statements and pamphlets denouncing the Saudi-American alliance and privately funded religious scholars and publications that echoed his grievances. He became a central figure in what would later be described as the Sahwa, awakening movement, a wave of Islamic revivalism in the kingdom that sought a return to stricter interpretations of Islam and greater independence from Western influence. Eventually, the Saudi regime forced his silence. By 1991, the pressure became unbearable. Osama's finances were restricted, his travel was curtailed, and he was effectively sidelined from the national discourse. Rather than submit or recant, Osama chose exile. He left Saudi Arabia voluntarily, but under pressure, and relocated to Sudan, a country then under the control of the National Islamic Front, a militant Islamist regime led by Hassan al-Turabi. In Sudan, Osama found temporary refuge in a new base of operations. He also found new allies and causes. His time in Sudan would mark the next evolution in his ideological and operational development, from a militant dissident to the architect of a global jihadist movement. Back in Saudi Arabia, his departure was seen as a necessary containment of a growing threat. But the seeds of rebellion had already been planted. Bin Laden had begun to see the Muslim world not as a series of national states, but as a single unified ummah oppressed by local tyrants and foreign imperialists. The West, and the United States in particular, had become central enemies in this vision. And Osama believed that the Afghan jihad had already demonstrated the path forward. Asymmetric warfare, carried out by the faithful, could defeat even the most powerful empires. What remained was to build a network that could make this vision a reality, a global organization dedicated not just to national liberation or spiritual revival, but to the overthrow of the world order as it existed. In Sudan, Osama would begin that work. Part 5. Exile in Sudan. Building a global network of jihad. Osama bin Laden arrived in Sudan in 1992, landing in a country that had become a beacon for Islamist radicals across the Muslim world. The North African nation was then under the control of a hardline Islamic government, led in practice by the charismatic ideologue Hassan al-Turabi, though nominally headed by President Omar al-Bashir. It offered a rare combination of ideological sympathy and state protection for those like Osama, who were seeking to continue the momentum of the anti-Soviet jihad beyond Afghanistan. In Sudan, Osama began a new chapter in his life, one marked by strategic planning, financial investment, and organizational consolidation. It was in Khartoum, the Sudanese capital, that he first laid the groundwork for the network that would ultimately become known to the world as al-Qaeda. Initially, Osama operated under a veil of legitimacy. He set up numerous business ventures in Sudan, ranging from agriculture to construction and trade. These included a transportation company, a road-building enterprise, and several farming projects. While some of these businesses served practical functions and even contributed to the local economy, many also served as covers for training camps, weapons smuggling, and the movement of funds across international borders. The Sudanese authorities, though closely allied with bin Laden ideologically at the time, turned a blind eye to the more secretive activities in exchange for his financial investments. By all accounts, Osama lived in relative comfort during his years in Sudan. He established a fortified compound on the outskirts of Khartoum and continued to receive visitors from across the Islamic world. Veterans of the Afghan War, Islamic scholars, political dissidents, and jihadist aspirants. He was treated with respect and even reverence in some circles, regarded as a man who had both the religious conviction and the financial power to challenge global injustice. But he was no longer just a Saudi exile with a grudge. In Sudan, Osama became the center of gravity for a loose but growing international movement. Throughout the early 1990s, he and his inner circle expanded their contacts in Egypt, Algeria, Yemen, Pakistan, and the Palestinian territories. Many of these relationships had their origins in the jihadist networks established during the war in Afghanistan, but they now evolved into something more ambitious. A coordinated global effort to challenge the influence of the West, particularly the United States, and to spark Islamic revolutions in Muslim-majority countries. It was during this period that bin Laden's vision of jihad began to change, no longer satisfied with confronting only regional enemies. Secular Arab regimes or localized threats, he began speaking more openly about the far enemy, the United States and its allies. He argued that corrupt Muslim governments were mere puppets of Western powers, and that to defeat them, the Muslim world had to first defeat their sponsors. This was a major departure from earlier generations of Islamist thinkers who had prioritized internal reform or regime change. Osama's approach was fundamentally transnational. One of the most important developments of this era was the formalization of Maktab al-Khidmat Nimyaki, or the Services Bureau, a logistical organization founded during the Afghan War that was now repurposed as a global jihadist infrastructure. It handled recruitment, transportation, financing, and training for Islamist fighters. Although still informal in its structure, this network evolved throughout the early 1990s until it eventually coalesced into al-Qaeda, meaning the base or the foundation. By 1994, al-Qaeda was no longer a concept. It was a functioning entity. Osama's growing notoriety, however, drew increased scrutiny. Western intelligence agencies began to take serious notice of his activities. While the Soviet-Afghan War had ended, many of the foreign fighters who had participated in it were now appearing in conflict zones across the world, from the civil war in Algeria to insurgencies in Egypt, Chechnya, and Bosnia. Often, Osama bin Laden's name, or those of his associates, appeared in connection with these events directly or indirectly. The CIA, MI6, and other intelligence organizations began building extensive dossiers on bin Laden and his activities. Back in Saudi Arabia, bin Laden's criticism of the monarchy became increasingly inflammatory. In 1994, after repeated warnings, the Saudi government revoked his citizenship, a symbolic and practical rupture that finalized his estrangement from the House of Saud. His family, including members of the powerful bin Laden business conglomerate, were reportedly pressured to cut ties with him. Financial channels between Osama and the kingdom were closed. Yet by this time, Osama was already heavily relying on his own diversified investments and external funding from sympathizers around the world. The turning point that truly internationalized bin Laden's movement, though, came in 1995. In November of that year, a car bomb exploded outside the offices of the Saudi National Guard in Riyadh, killing 5 American military advisors and 2 Indian nationals. Though Osama did not claim direct responsibility, American intelligence services strongly suspected that elements associated with al-Qaeda had helped facilitate the attack. It marked the first time American lives were taken by operatives linked to bin Laden's growing network. The consequences of bin Laden's Sudanese refuge were beginning to catch up with both him and his hosts. By the mid-1990s, the United States and its allies began applying significant diplomatic pressure on Sudan to expel bin Laden and shut down his operations. The Sudanese economy, already under stress, was further hit by economic sanctions. Additionally, bin Laden's primary patron within the regime, Hassan al-Turabi, was losing political influence. By 1996, the writing was on the wall. Sudan, no longer a reliable haven, gave Osama a quiet ultimatum: leave the country. It was not a formal expulsion, but the message was clear. Osama complied. That same year, he packed up his network, gathered many of his loyal fighters and associates, and headed back to Afghanistan. There, a new force, the Taliban, had just seized control of large parts of the country, promising a return to Islamic purity and law. They were eager to welcome him, and bin Laden was eager to resume the struggle in a country where jihad had once proven so successful. His relocation to Afghanistan marked yet another metamorphosis, from financier and network builder to chief ideologue of global jihad. In the years to come, he would abandon the shadows and take on the mantle of public leadership in a war he was now convinced was divinely ordained, a holy war against the West and against the global order as it stood. Part 6. Return to Afghanistan. The final ascent of al-Qaeda. When Osama bin Laden returned to Afghanistan in 1996, the country was once again in turmoil. The Soviet-backed regime had long since collapsed, but no stable government had emerged in its place. Instead, Afghanistan had descended into a bitter civil war among former mujahideen factions. Amid the chaos, a new force known as the Taliban, composed largely of former religious students, or Talibs, from Islamic seminaries, had swept through the southern part of the country, promising a return to Islamic order and the imposition of strict Sharia law. The Taliban offered bin Laden not just sanctuary, but ideological alignment. Both parties shared a vision of a puritanical Islamic order, disdain for Western influence, and a desire to recreate the social structures of a mythologized early Islamic caliphate. In return for protection, bin Laden offered the Taliban logistical support, financial backing, and a ready-made infrastructure for training Islamist fighters. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, and one that would have global consequences. By mid-1996, bin Laden was once again ensconced in Afghanistan, operating out of a series of compounds in remote and mountainous regions. He re-established training camps in areas like Jalalabad and Khost, facilities where foreign recruits would undergo indoctrination and learn guerrilla tactics, bomb-making, and assassination techniques. These camps attracted militants from across the Muslim world: Algeria, Egypt, Chechnya, Yemen, Indonesia, and beyond. But bin Laden was no longer content to remain in the shadows. In August 1996, from his Afghan redoubt, he issued the declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places. In this document, he portrayed the United States as the principal adversary of Islam and called for strong opposition to American presence in Saudi Arabia and the broader Muslim world. This was the first public declaration of opposition by al-Qaeda against the U.S., a moment that marked the beginning of its global campaign. Over the next 2 years, bin Laden and al-Qaeda moved from general ideological statements to deliberate and impactful actions. The organization began focusing on U.S. military and diplomatic sites abroad. The August 1998 bombings of the American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, marked al-Qaeda's significant emergence on the international scene. The attacks were carefully coordinated, complex, and tragic, resulting in the loss of more than 200 lives and injuring thousands. The intent was unmistakable. Bin Laden's opposition to the United States had turned into direct action. In response, the Clinton administration launched Operation Infinite Reach, a series of missile strikes targeting al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan, believed to be connected to weapons production. The effort did not succeed in eliminating bin Laden, and if anything, it increased his prominence among supporters, casting him as a Muslim figure who had challenged a global power and survived. The unsuccessful U.S. response emboldened bin Laden. In 1999, preparations began for what would become one of the most consequential attacks in recent history. The plan to strike within the United States using commercial aircraft was underway, and the core operatives were already in training and being relocated. During this period, bin Laden's image among supporters grew to almost legendary status. The affluent sheikh who gave up luxury to stand on the front lines, who resisted a superpower, and who claimed that a turning point in history was imminent. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda evolved into a multinational, layered organization. Its leadership, or advisory council, consisted of individuals from Egypt, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. It functioned in both hierarchical and decentralized ways, allowing it to adapt and continue despite setbacks. At its center were individuals like Ayman al-Zawahiri, an Egyptian physician and former leader of the Islamic jihad movement, who became bin Laden's most trusted ideological partner and eventual successor. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, under the leadership of Mullah Muhammad Omar, continued to provide shelter to bin Laden despite rising international concern. In 1999, the United Nations enacted sanctions against the Taliban for offering him refuge. Nevertheless, they chose not to hand him over. Part of this decision stemmed from traditional codes of hospitality, but it was also influenced by shared political and religious views. The Taliban saw bin Laden as a useful figure in their vision of forming an Islamic government. In February 1998, bin Laden took another significant step. Along with other militant leaders, he issued the fatwa of the World Islamic Front for Jihad against Jews and Crusaders. It was a call urging Muslims to take action against Americans and their allies, civilian or military, as a perceived moral obligation. With this proclamation, bin Laden fully positioned himself not just as a regional actor, but as a self-declared global religious figure. There was no longer uncertainty about al-Qaeda's objectives. As the year 2000 began, momentum was growing. In October, al-Qaeda members carried out a bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen, resulting in the deaths of 17 American sailors and injuring many others. Once again, the United States did not deliver a decisive response. Within al-Qaeda, this was viewed as a sign of favor from above. Morale increased. The course toward 9/11 was in motion. By the summer of 2001, the final elements of the September 11th attacks had been arranged. Participants had entered the United States, joined flight schools, and assimilated into American society. They were trained, resourced, and directed by al-Qaeda's central leadership. All that remained was the implementation. Part 7, September 11th, 2001, the day the world changed. By mid-2001, the full scope of al-Qaeda's planning had come together. The group under Osama bin Laden's leadership was completing preparations for what would become one of the most consequential acts of violence in modern history, a coordinated, multi-target operation inside the United States using hijacked commercial airliners. This was not simply a symbolic gesture. It was a carefully designed attempt to impact key centers of American economic and military presence, aiming for widespread visibility and psychological effect. The primary architect behind the operation was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a Pakistani citizen and veteran ideological planner, who had first presented the idea to bin Laden in 1996. The concept, bold and far-reaching, involved the simultaneous hijacking of several civilian aircraft to strike landmark targets. Bin Laden at first showed caution, but was eventually convinced. He believed this would be a powerful act that could stir the broader Muslim world, intensify opposition to Western influence, and prompt military engagement that would draw Western powers into extended conflict in the Islamic world. By early 1999, bin Laden had officially endorsed the strategy, and efforts accelerated. The selection process for the operatives began, prioritizing those who could remain unnoticed in Western settings. A team, mostly from Saudi Arabia, with others from Egypt and Lebanon, was assembled. 4 of them, Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, Zia Jara, and Hani Hanjar, were assigned to pilot the aircraft. Each had prior flying experience or received training at U.S. aviation schools. The remaining members were instructed to assist in controlling the planes and ensuring the plan's execution. Throughout 2000 and 2001, these support operatives entered the U.S. using student or tourist visas. They settled in Florida, Arizona, and California, blending into the broad and diverse landscape of American cities. Financial resources were moved through a complex network of al-Qaeda facilitators, charitable fronts, and sympathetic donors. The entire initiative was carried out with a high degree of secrecy and coordination. Even U.S. intelligence agencies, though increasingly alert to possible al-Qaeda activity, did not fully piece together the developing plot. By the summer of 2001, the specific targets had been finalized. The World Trade Center in New York City, a prominent symbol of international commerce, and the Pentagon in Virginia, the central hub of U.S. defense operations. And a fourth, as yet unidentified, believed by analysts to be either the U.S. Capitol building or the White House. The chosen date was September 11, 2001. On the morning of that day, 19 hijackers operating in 4 separate teams boarded commercial aircraft departing from East Coast airports. The timing was precise. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston at 7:59 a.m. United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston at 8:14 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 left Washington, D.C. at 8:20 a.m. United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark at 8:42 a.m. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at over 700 km/h, instantly killing hundreds and igniting a massive fireball. Initially, confusion reigned. Many assumed it was a tragic accident, but just 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 struck the South Tower in full view of cameras, now trained on the burning North Tower. The world instantly understood. This was no accident. It was a deliberate act of war. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 plowed into the Pentagon, carving a deadly gash into the military nerve center of the United States and killing 125 people in the building and 59 on board. The final flight, Flight 93, was headed for Washington, but thanks to the bravery of passengers who stormed the cockpit, it crashed into a field in Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m., killing all 40 passengers and crew, but sparing hundreds more in its intended target. The impact of the strikes on the Twin Towers was catastrophic. Within the hour, both skyscrapers collapsed in scenes broadcast live across the globe. The South Tower fell at 9:59 a.m., followed by the North Tower at 10:28 a.m. Massive clouds of dust, smoke, and debris engulfed lower Manhattan. Emergency responders, overwhelmed but resolute, rushed into the infernos. Many would never emerge. By the end of the day, 2,137 victims had lost their lives, including citizens from over 90 countries. The attacks were the deadliest terrorist incident in human history and the most lethal foreign assault on American soil since Pearl Harbor in 1941. The psychological effect was equally seismic. Stock markets closed, air travel was suspended, the U.S. military was placed on high alert. Across the Western world, a sense of vulnerability descended. No longer was terrorism something that happened elsewhere. It had come to the heart of global power. Osama bin Laden at first denied involvement, issuing a statement 5 days later through Al Jazeera disavowing responsibility. But the U.S. intelligence community was unconvinced. Mounting evidence, including communication intercepts, video footage, and testimonies from captured operatives, soon made clear that al-Qaeda and bin Laden personally had orchestrated the attacks. By 2004, a new video was released in which bin Laden openly acknowledged directing the operation. To bin Laden, 9/11 was not just a tactical success, it was a moment of ideological triumph. He had struck America on its own soil, exposed its vulnerabilities, and rallied disaffected Muslims worldwide. But he also fundamentally misunderstood the ferocity of the response it would provoke. Part 8. The Aftermath of September 11th. War in Afghanistan, the Tora Bora Escape, and the Global Hunt for bin Laden. Following the devastation of the September 11, 2001 attacks, where nearly 3,000 people were killed in the worst act of terrorism in modern history, Osama bin Laden, already one of the most wanted men in the world, became the singular face of global terrorism. The United States, still reeling from the scale and audacity of the attack, swiftly moved from mourning to military action, entering a period of counteroffensive that would reshape world affairs for decades to come. For bin Laden, it marked the beginning of his final chapter, a decade spent in exile, hiding from the largest and most technologically advanced manhunt in history. Immediately after the attacks, the administration of U.S. President George W. Bush identified bin Laden and his organization, al-Qaeda, as the perpetrators. Bin Laden had not only claimed ideological responsibility for the attacks, but had personally directed their planning and execution. The September 11th attacks were not just a tactical blow, but a symbolic one, striking at the heart of American finance, military strength, and national psyche. On September 18, 2001, just 1 week after the attacks, the U.S. Congress passed the Authorization for Use of Military Force, AUMF, granting the president authority to use all necessary military power against nations, organizations, or individuals who had aided in the planning or execution of 9/11. Though framed as a temporary and targeted resolution, the AUMF would become the legal cornerstone of a sweeping and often controversial global campaign known as the War on Terror. It would lead to military operations not just in Afghanistan, but later in Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and beyond. The first military objective was straightforward: to dismantle the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which had been harboring bin Laden since 1996. Despite American and international demands, the Taliban refused to surrender bin Laden. Their spiritual leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar, insisted that bin Laden would not be turned over without evidence and due process, conditions which the U.S. flatly rejected, considering them stalling tactics. As diplomatic overtures broke down, the U.S. and its allies began preparing for a full-scale military invasion. On October 7, 2001, the United States and the United Kingdom launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The campaign began with coordinated airstrikes targeting Taliban air defenses, command centers, training camps, and suspected al-Qaeda hideouts. Cruise missiles, stealth bombers, and drone surveillance were all deployed in a demonstration of overwhelming firepower. Within days, American Special Operations Forces were on the ground, working with the anti-Taliban coalition known as the Northern Alliance. These soldiers provided laser targeting for airstrikes, assisted in intelligence gathering, and helped direct Afghan militias during ground engagements. Bin Laden, who had been monitoring the global reaction to 9/11 from his sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan, knew the American response would be swift and unrelenting. Prior to the U.S. invasion, he moved between various hideouts in Nangarhar province and eventually established himself in the mountainous region of Tora Bora, a natural fortress near the Pakistan border. This area, dotted with caves and rugged terrain, had been used extensively by the mujahideen during their war against the Soviets in the 1980s. Bin Laden had helped finance and construct parts of the tunnel network himself years earlier, giving him a deep understanding of its defensive potential. By mid-November 2001, American-led coalition forces had captured key cities, including Mazar-e-Sharif, Herat, and most significantly, Kabul, the Afghan capital. Taliban resistance began collapsing across the country, and by early December, the southern stronghold of Kandahar, home to the Taliban's spiritual leadership, was under siege. Mullah Omar and other senior figures fled into hiding. For many, the swift dismantling of the Taliban regime seemed like a remarkable military success. However, the true prize, bin Laden himself, remained at large. Intelligence reports in November and early December indicated that he was in Tora Bora with hundreds of loyal fighters. U.S. commanders planned a major assault on the area. Despite warnings from military and intelligence officials that a larger force was needed to encircle the mountains and prevent bin Laden's escape, the mission was largely delegated to Afghan militia units with American air and logistical support. The assumption was that these local fighters had both the will and the ability to capture bin Laden in the treacherous terrain. From December 3rd to December 17, 2001, the Battle of Tora Bora raged. American planes dropped over 700,000 pounds of bombs, and U.S. Special Forces provided targeting and ground coordination. Yet bin Laden, with his knowledge of the terrain and a network of trusted loyalists, managed to evade capture. Satellite phone intercepts and on-the-ground intelligence later suggested that he had crossed into Pakistan sometime around December 16th or 17th. He may have used mule trains, smoke cover, and bribes to Pakistani border guards to slip through. The failure to capture bin Laden at Tora Bora would haunt U.S. policymakers and military leaders for years to come. It was arguably the last known opportunity for a direct kill or capture for several years. Many blame the Pentagon's decision not to send in additional American troops, fearing the political optics of another prolonged ground war. CIA officers on the ground, including Gary Burnson, would later write openly of their frustration, noting that Afghan militias were often unreliable, poorly trained, and susceptible to bribes from al-Qaeda operatives. With bin Laden now across the border in Pakistan, the nature of the war on terror changed dramatically. Afghanistan had fallen, but the central target had vanished. A new phase of covert operations began, focused on intelligence gathering, drone surveillance, and the cultivation of human assets within the tribal regions of northwest Pakistan. The U.S. launched the CIA's most expansive manhunt in history, involving satellite monitoring, signal interception, and clandestine missions. Rewards of up to $25 million, later increased to $50 million, were offered for information leading to his arrest or death. From his hideouts in Pakistan, bin Laden began releasing carefully staged videos and audio recordings through Arabic language networks like Al Jazeera. In these messages, he praised the 9/11 attackers, threatened new operations, and lambasted the U.S. presence in the Muslim world. His face became one of the most recognized on the planet, yet his location remained a mystery. Analysts speculated that he was hiding in the tribal region of Waziristan, a lawless and mountainous borderland riddled with Islamist groups and outside the effective control of the Pakistani state. At the same time, bin Laden's ideological and organizational reach continued to grow. While al-Qaeda's core leadership had been weakened by U.S. airstrikes and arrests, regional branches and affiliates began to emerge, some self-declared and others directly connected to bin Laden through couriers. These included groups in North Africa, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the Arabian Peninsula, al-Qaeda in Yemen, and Southeast Asia, Jamaah Islamiyah. The network began to evolve into a loosely connected global franchise, united more by ideology than central command. In the United States, homeland security measures were ramped up to unprecedented levels. The newly created Department of Homeland Security consolidated over 20 federal agencies and introduced airport screenings, no-fly lists, and anti-terrorist funding programs for cities and critical infrastructure. The Patriot Act, passed in late 2001, expanded the government's surveillance and detention powers, leading to ongoing debates about civil liberties and national security. Osama bin Laden from the shadows continued to shape global events. Though removed from battlefield leadership, he remained a powerful symbol and spiritual guide to jihadists worldwide. While American forces pursued al-Qaeda remnants in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and later opened a new front in Iraq in 2003, bin Laden's elusiveness became both a tactical frustration and a propaganda victory for extremists. He had orchestrated the deadliest terrorist attack in modern history and remained at large, a living legend in the eyes of his followers. The search for bin Laden intensified in scope, budget, and desperation. Still, the man who had orchestrated 9/11 managed to remain hidden in the very region the United States was focused on, protected by loyal supporters, a shrewd operational sense of survival, and perhaps the ambivalence or complicity of local authorities in Pakistan. Part 9. Hiding in plain sight. The last years and the death of Osama bin Laden. For nearly a decade after the September 11th attacks, Osama bin Laden evaded the most intensive manhunt in history. Tracked by satellites, hunted by special forces, and pursued by intelligence agencies from dozens of nations, he nonetheless managed to survive. His ability to disappear into the shadows became a source of both deep frustration for the United States and a symbol of resilience for radical Islamists. Yet while the world searched the mountains of Waziristan and theorized about caves along the Afghan-Pakistani border, Osama bin Laden spent his final years hiding in a large compound in the relatively quiet and urban town of Abbottabad, Pakistan. Just a short distance from the country's premier military academy, bin Laden's move to Abbottabad around 2005 marked a profound change in his existence. No longer roaming the remote tribal areas, he settled into a more sedentary life. The compound where he lived was not a traditional safe house. It was a purpose-built structure, large, fortified, and surrounded by high walls with barbed wire, few windows, and a conspicuous lack of internet or telephone connectivity. Designed to avoid detection, the house had no direct phone lines or internet access, and its occupants burned their trash rather than placing it outside. Neighbors thought it odd but had no idea that the world's most wanted man was living just a few hundred meters away. Inside, bin Laden lived with multiple members of his extended family, 3 wives, at least 8 of his children, and a few close aides and bodyguards. Reports suggest he followed a strict routine, rising before dawn for prayer, reading religious texts, writing in his journal, and occasionally recording video or audio messages that would be smuggled out and released by al-Qaeda's media arm. Despite his isolation, bin Laden remained deeply involved in shaping the ideology and direction of al-Qaeda. He reviewed and approved potential targets, managed correspondence with key lieutenants, and issued guidance on how to sustain the group's global relevance, even as the United States targeted its leadership with drone strikes and special operations raids. His hideout was located just a few kilometers from the Pakistan Military Academy, often likened to the U.S. West Point. This proximity raised suspicions and later, international outrage, as it suggested that elements within the Pakistani intelligence or military establishment may have known of his presence, or, at the very least, failed to detect it. Pakistan, a supposed ally of the United States in the War on Terror, had received billions in military and economic aid. Yet for years, bin Laden lived comfortably in a compound located in one of the country's most militarized regions. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda itself was evolving. Bin Laden's core group had been weakened by drone strikes and arrests, but franchise groups around the world were rising in influence. In Yemen, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, launched a series of attempted attacks on Western targets, including the 2009 Christmas Day underwear bombing and the 2010 cargo plane plot. In North Africa, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, expanded its reach into Mali and the Sahel. And in Iraq, a brutal offshoot of al-Qaeda, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, would later morph into ISIS, a group even more extreme and sectarian than bin Laden's own. Still, bin Laden remained a potent figure. For his followers, he was not just a strategist or ideologue. He was a living martyr, a man who had defied the world's only superpower and survived. For the U.S. and its allies, his death remained a priority. The CIA never ceased its hunt, and by 2010, a new lead began to emerge: the location of a trusted courier known only as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, whose name had surfaced during interrogations of Guantanamo Bay detainees years earlier. After tracking the courier's movements across Pakistan, CIA analysts identified a compound in Abbottabad that fit a startling profile: highly secure, custom-built, and sheltering a man whose habits resembled bin Laden's. Over the course of 8 months, the agency built a replica of the compound, monitored its inhabitants, and consulted with President Barack Obama and senior military leaders. There was no absolute proof that bin Laden was inside, but the pattern of life, the behavior of residents, and the intelligence suggested that he likely was. On the night of May 1, 2011, under the cover of darkness, 2 Black Hawk helicopters carrying U.S. Navy SEALs from SEAL Team 6, along with CIA operatives, crossed into Pakistani airspace from Afghanistan. The mission, codenamed Operation Neptune Spear, had been rehearsed for months. It was conducted without Pakistan's knowledge, out of fear that leaks might allow bin Laden to escape. The SEALs arrived just after 1 a.m. local time. One helicopter suffered a mechanical failure and made a controlled crash landing inside the compound. The team quickly breached the perimeter, moving from room to room. Within 40 minutes, they had killed several individuals, including one of bin Laden's sons and two couriers. In an upstairs bedroom, they found Osama bin Laden. He was unarmed but reportedly did not surrender. He was shot in the head and chest. At 1:51 a.m., bin Laden was declared dead. The SEALs recovered computer drives, documents, and personal effects, gathering what they hoped would be a trove of intelligence about al-Qaeda's operations. His body was flown to the USS Carl Vinson, where it was washed and prepared according to Islamic tradition. In keeping with U.S. policy, and to avoid creating a shrine, his body was buried at sea within 24 hours. News of bin Laden's death spread rapidly. In Washington, D.C., crowds gathered outside the White House chanting, "USA! USA!" In New York City, survivors and first responders from 9/11 wept and cheered. President Obama, addressing the nation from the East Room, announced, "Justice has been done." Yet bin Laden's death, while symbolically significant, did not end terrorism or even destroy al-Qaeda. The network, though fragmented, persisted. Other groups, like ISIS, would rise in his wake, adopting even more brutal methods. But for many, the death of Osama bin Laden closed a chapter that had begun with smoke and fire in New York a decade earlier. The man who had shattered the illusion of American invincibility was finally gone. In his final years, bin Laden had grown increasingly concerned with al-Qaeda's branding and internal divisions. Letters found in the compound revealed that he was worried about al-Qaeda's image, particularly the indiscriminate killing of Muslims by some of its affiliates. He feared the movement was losing its legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary Muslims. He advised restraint, strategic patience, and greater care in targeting. Ironically, the man whose name was synonymous with bloodshed spent his last days urging his followers to avoid unnecessary carnage. Osama bin Laden's life and death remain defining markers of the 21st century. Born into elite privilege in Saudi Arabia, shaped by ideological conviction, and radicalized by war, he became the face of global jihad. He declared war on the world's most powerful nation, triggered wars across 2 continents, and fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape. His vision of a restored Islamic caliphate, through violence, martyrdom, and terror, reverberated across borders, inspiring thousands and horrifying millions. His legacy is not one of triumph, but of destruction. He did not establish a caliphate, nor did he unite the Muslim world. Instead, he left behind a trail of ruined cities, broken families, and poisoned ideologies. In the end, he died not on a battlefield, but in a locked room. His final moments marked not by glory, but by sudden violence in the night.